The sun was just beginning to dip below the horizon, painting the small suburban neighborhood in hues of orange and pink. It was the kind of evening where everything felt calm, almost peaceful, as if the world itself had decided to take a moment to breathe. Down on Main Street, a few shopkeepers were locking up for the night, and the occasional jogger passed by, nodding politely to familiar faces. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, or at least thought they did. That's when it happened. The roar of a motorcycle shattered the stillness, ripping through the air like a wild beast. Heads turned as a sleek black bike sped down the street, its rider wearing a leather jacket and dark helmet that obscured his face. He was fast, reckless, and unapologetic, weaving between cars and ignoring every stop sign in his path. For most people, he was just another thrill-seeker, someone who didn't care about the rules or the people around him. But that wasn't entirely true. This biker wasn't just reckless, he was dangerous. At the corner of Elm and Park, an elderly woman, Mrs. Evelyn Carter, stepped out onto the crosswalk. She was carrying a small bag of groceries, her steps careful but confident. Evelyn was well loved in the neighborhood, known for her warm smile and the way she always stopped to chat with everyone she met. She had lived here for over 30 years, raised her family here, and watched as the quiet streets grew busier with time. Tonight, like every other night, she was walking home from her favorite little market. The biker didn't slow down. A few witnesses shouted warnings, but it all happened too fast. The motorcycle came out of nowhere, swerving just enough to avoid hitting her head-on, but not enough to keep from knocking her to the ground. Evelyn's groceries scattered across the pavement as she fell, her frail body crumpling like a leaf. The biker didn't stop, didn't even glance back. He sped off into the night, leaving the stunned crowd behind to rush to her aid. For most, this would be the beginning of an ordinary tragedy, one more story of a reckless driver leaving chaos in their wake. But Evelyn Carter wasn't just anyone. What the biker didn't know, what no one there could have imagined, was that Evelyn's son, Ryan Carter, had just arrived back in town. And Ryan wasn't your average son. He was an off-duty Navy SEAL, trained to handle the toughest situations with precision and resolve. He hadn't seen his mother fall, but when the news reached him moments later, something inside him shifted. Ryan was no stranger to danger or injustice, but this was personal. This wasn't a mission assigned by a commanding officer. This was his mother. And as he listened to the shaken voices describing the biker, the anger bubbling inside him was matched only by his determination to make things right. As Ryan set out to track down the man who had hurt his mother, the streets of this quiet town were about to become a battleground. The reckless biker thought he could get away, but he had no idea who he was up against. And Ryan, he wasn't about to let this slide. The faint sound of sirens echoed in the distance as neighbors crowded around Evelyn, their faces etched with concern. Someone had already called an ambulance, and a kind stranger draped their jacket over her trembling shoulders. Evelyn, ever the resilient one, waved off their panic with a faint smile. "I'm fine, really," she said, her voice steady despite the visible scrape on her cheek and the way she clutched her arm. "It's just a little tumble." But those who knew her could see through her brave front. Her knees shook slightly as she tried to stand, and the light in her eyes was dimmer than usual. It wasn't just the fall that had shaken her. It was the audacity, the recklessness of the biker who had left her there without a second thought. Ryan Carter stood just a few blocks away, unaware of the storm that was about to pull him in. He had flown in the night before, hoping for a quiet visit. It had been months since his last deployment, and he missed the familiarity of home, the smell of his mother's cooking, the sound of her laughter when they reminisced about old family memories. He had barely unpacked his bag when his phone buzzed. "Ryan, you need to come down to Main Street right now," his neighbor, Mr. Jensen, said, his voice strained. "It's your mom." Those words hit him like a freight train. Without asking for details, Ryan grabbed his keys and rushed out the door, his heart pounding in his chest. Every possible scenario ran through his mind. Was she okay? Was it an accident? The few minutes it took to get there felt like hours. When he arrived, Ryan saw the small crowd gathered near the crosswalk. His mom was sitting on the curb, surrounded by concerned faces, but what struck him most was the look in her eyes, calm but distant, as if she was trying to process what had just happened. "Mom." Ryan pushed through the crowd, kneeling beside her. He gently took her hand, scanning her for injuries. "What happened? Are you hurt?" Evelyn's expression softened when she saw him, and for a moment her tough exterior cracked. "Oh, Ryan, I'm fine," she said, though her voice quivered slightly. "Just a little shaken up, that's all." "She's lucky it wasn't worse," Mr. Jensen interjected, his tone heavy with anger. That maniac on the motorcycle barely missed her, didn't even stop to check if she was alive. Ryan's jaw clenched, his gaze shifting to the skid marks on the pavement. The pieces of her groceries were still scattered, a loaf of bread crushed under a passing car. His chest tightened. He had seen a lot in his life, things that most people couldn't even imagine. But seeing his mother like this ignited a fire inside him that was hard to contain. "Did anyone see which way he went?" Ryan asked, his voice calm but laced with an edge. A younger woman in the crowd nodded. He sped off toward the highway. Black bike, no plates that I could see. The guy was wearing a dark helmet, too. Made it impossible to see his face. Ryan's mind started working immediately, piecing together the details. He wasn't just angry. He was focused, his training kicking in without a second thought. This wasn't just about finding the biker. It was about ensuring no one else got hurt. The ambulance arrived shortly after, and the paramedics insisted on checking Evelyn out, despite her protests. "It's just a scratch," she kept saying, but Ryan knew better. He stayed by her side, reassuring her with quiet words while keeping an ear out for any more details from the witnesses. As they loaded her into the ambulance, Ryan turned to Mr. Jensen. "Can you grab her things and bring them to the house? I'm going to follow the ambulance and make sure she's okay." Mr. Jensen nodded. "Of course, don't worry about a thing." At the hospital, the doctors confirmed that Evelyn had no major injuries, just some bruising and a sprained wrist. Ryan felt a wave of relief, but couldn't shake the anger simmering beneath the surface. Evelyn, sensing his unease, placed a hand on his arm. "Ryan, don't do anything foolish," she said softly. "Let the police handle this." He gave her a small smile, but his silence spoke volumes. He wasn't planning on sitting this one out. After ensuring his mom was settled back at home and had everything she needed, Ryan went to his car and drove back to the scene of the incident. The street was quiet now, the crowd long gone, but Ryan wasn't looking for witnesses anymore. He was looking for clues. Walking along the crosswalk, he studied the skid marks more closely. The biker had been going too fast, that much was clear. He followed the faint trail of rubber and noticed a small piece of torn fabric caught on the edge of a nearby bush. Picking it up, he examined it closely. It was black, likely from the biker's jacket or gear. It wasn't much, but it was something. As Ryan stood there, the faint hum of a motorcycle in the distance caught his attention. He turned sharply, his eyes scanning the horizon, but the sound faded as quickly as it had come. It was a reminder that the man he was looking for could be anywhere, and that this wasn't going to be easy. Back at the house, Ryan pulled out his laptop and started researching. He wasn't just relying on luck, he was methodical. He looked up local motorcycle groups, events, and forums. A biker that reckless wasn't just a loner, he was likely part of a scene. The hours ticked by as Ryan pieced together a mental map of possible leads. He wasn't sure what he'd find, but one thing was certain: he wouldn't stop until he had answers. And as the night deepened, so did his resolve. The biker might have thought he could disappear into the night, but Ryan knew better. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The following morning, Ryan woke early, his mind still racing with the details of the previous day. His mother had insisted she was fine, and though she smiled as she sipped her tea at the kitchen table, Ryan could see the way she winced every time she moved her wrist. She didn't complain, she never did, but that only made his determination grow stronger. After making sure Evelyn had everything she needed, Ryan grabbed his jacket and headed out. Just running an errand, he told her, but the truth was he couldn't sit still. He needed to do something. Ryan's first stop was a small diner on the edge of town. It wasn't just any diner. It was a popular hangout spot for bikers passing through the area. He'd been here before as a kid, back when his father used to bring him along for a burger after soccer practice. The memories felt distant now, almost like they belonged to another life. Walking in, Ryan immediately scanned the room. A few people were seated at booths, sipping coffee or chatting casually, but his attention was drawn to a group of men sitting near the back. They wore leather jackets adorned with patches, their helmets resting on the table. These weren't just casual riders, they were part of a crew. Ryan approached the counter and ordered a coffee, his ears tuned to the conversation at the back. The men were laughing, their voices low but audible. They were talking about a ride they'd taken the night before, boasting about the speeds they'd hit and the close calls along the way. One of them, a tall man with a scar running down his cheek, leaned back in his chair and chuckled. "That guy on the black bike last night? Man, he's got no fear. Took off like a bat out of hell. Didn't even flinch when that old lady hit the pavement." Ryan's grip tightened around his coffee cup. He fought to keep his expression neutral as he turned slightly, catching just enough of the man's face to remember it. Scarcheek, as Ryan dubbed him in his mind, might not be the biker, but he clearly knew something. "Any idea where he went?" one of the other men asked, a hint of curiosity in his tone. Scarcheek shrugged. "Probably to that old warehouse off Route 9. You know, the one they've been using as a hangout. Not sure how long he'll stay there, though. Guy's always moving." Ryan didn't stick around long enough to hear the rest. He left a few dollars on the counter and walked out, his mind already racing with possibilities. The warehouse wasn't far. He could be there in less than 20 minutes. As he drove, Ryan's thoughts drifted back to his mother. She would never ask him to go this far. She'd tell him to let it go, to trust the system to handle it. But Ryan couldn't shake the image of her lying on the pavement, her groceries scattered, and the distant sound of that motorcycle roaring away. When he reached the warehouse, Ryan parked his car a safe distance away and approached on foot. The building was old and worn, its windows cracked and its walls covered in graffiti. A few motorcycles were parked outside, their shiny exteriors glinting in the midday sun. Ryan crouched behind a row of bushes, observing the scene. A few men milled about near the entrance, smoking and chatting. They looked relaxed, unaware of the storm brewing just a short distance away. Ryan didn't move right away. He wasn't reckless. He knew better than to charge in without a plan. Instead, he watched, memorizing their faces and noting any details that might help later. He couldn't be sure if the biker he was looking for was inside, but his gut told him he was on the right track. After a while, one of the men stepped away from the group, pulling out his phone. He walked a few paces away, his voice low but clear enough for Ryan to catch snippets of the conversation. "Yeah, he's here. No, I don't think he's leaving anytime soon. All right, I'll keep an eye out." Ryan's instincts sharpened. Whoever this guy was talking about had to be important, or at least worth keeping tabs on. He stayed hidden until the man rejoined the group, then slowly backed away, careful not to make a sound. This wasn't the time to act. He needed more information, and rushing in would only make things worse. Back in his car, Ryan sat for a moment, his thoughts racing. He knew he was playing a dangerous game, but the stakes were too high to walk away. The biker might not have intended to hurt his mother, but his recklessness had consequences. Ryan couldn't let him keep riding like nothing had happened. That night, Ryan dug deeper. He reached out to an old friend from his Navy days, someone who had a knack for finding information that wasn't exactly public. With a little luck, and a few favors called in, Ryan got a name: Marcus Reaper Kane. Reaper, as it turned out, wasn't just any biker. He had a reputation for pushing limits, both on and off the road. He'd been in trouble before: reckless driving, bar fights, even a few theft charges, but nothing had ever stuck. He was slippery, always one step ahead of the law. Ryan's resolve hardened. This wasn't just about his mother anymore. Reaper was a danger to everyone, and Ryan wasn't going to stand by and let him keep getting away with it. But as Ryan sat in his darkened living room, the faint glow of his laptop screen illuminating his face, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. It was subtle at first, a flicker of movement outside the window, a shadow that seemed to linger a little too long. Ryan's training kicked in immediately. He turned off the laptop and moved silently through the house, his eyes scanning every corner. If someone was out there, they weren't going to catch him off guard. He reached the window and peered out, his pulse steady but heightened. The street was quiet, the same as it always was. But something felt off, like the calm before a storm. Ryan didn't sleep much that night, and as the first rays of sunlight broke through the horizon, he knew one thing for sure: he was closer to the truth than he'd realized, and someone out there didn't want him to find it. The next day, Ryan couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been outside his house the night before. He did a quick perimeter check in the morning, walking the yard and scanning for anything unusual. There were faint tire tracks in the gravel along the curb, marks that hadn't been there before. They didn't belong to any of the neighbors, and they certainly weren't from his car. Ryan knew what this meant. He was being watched. But instead of feeling fear, Ryan felt a spark of adrenaline. If they were watching him, it meant they were nervous. Maybe they knew he was closing in on Reaper. Maybe they didn't expect him to push this far. Either way, it told Ryan he was getting closer. He returned to the house and poured himself a cup of coffee, his mind already spinning with possibilities. He needed to stay one step ahead, and that meant being smart about his next move. Ryan pulled out a notepad and began jotting down everything he'd learned so far: Reaper's name, his connections, the warehouse on Route 9. Each piece of information was another thread in a web, and Ryan was determined to pull it tight. By mid-afternoon, Ryan decided it was time to go back to the warehouse. This time, he wasn't just going to observe, he needed answers. He packed a small bag with essentials, including a flashlight, gloves, and a first aid kit. He wasn't planning for trouble, but he knew better than to go in unprepared. When he arrived at the warehouse, the place seemed quieter than before. The motorcycles were still parked outside, but there were fewer of them this time. Ryan parked a safe distance away and approached on foot, his steps light and deliberate. As he got closer, he could hear voices inside, low and muffled, but clear enough to make out snippets of conversation. He crept around the side of the building, finding a cracked window that gave him a partial view of the interior. Reaper was there. Ryan recognized him instantly from the photo he'd seen the night before. The man was tall and broad-shouldered, with a confident swagger that seemed to fill the room. He wore the same black leather jacket Ryan had imagined, the edges frayed from years of wear. Reaper was leaning against a table, talking to two other men. "I'm telling you, we've got to lay low for a while," Reaper said, his tone sharp. "That old lady's kid isn't just anyone. He's military. I don't need that kind of heat." One of the men scoffed. "So what? He's just one guy. What's he gonna do?" Reaper shook his head. "You don't get it. Guys like him don't let things go. They don't stop until they've got what they want. Trust me, we don't want to find out how far he's willing to go." Ryan felt a flicker of satisfaction hearing the unease in Reaper's voice, but it was quickly replaced by a surge of determination. Reaper knew who he was, but that didn't mean Ryan had the upper hand. Not yet. Before Ryan could hear more, the sound of footsteps approached from behind. He froze, his hand instinctively reaching for the knife he carried at his side. Turning slowly, he saw a shadowy figure just a few feet away. It was one of the bikers, a younger man with a wiry frame and sharp eyes. For a moment, they stared at each other, the tension crackling in the air like a live wire. "Who the hell are you?" the man demanded, his voice low but firm. Ryan didn't answer. Instead, he moved quickly, stepping forward and grabbing the man's arm in one fluid motion. With a twist, he had him pinned against the side of the building, his hand covering the man's mouth to stifle any noise. "I'm not here to hurt you," Ryan whispered, his voice calm but commanding. "But if you make a sound, I'll make sure you regret it. Understand?" The man nodded, his eyes wide with fear. "Good," Ryan continued. "Now, you're going to tell me everything you know about Reaper. And if you lie, I'll know." The man hesitated for a moment, then nodded again. Okay, he whispered. "Reaper's been laying low since yesterday. He's got a stash spot in the woods outside of town, an old cabin. That's where he goes when things get too hot." Ryan studied the man's face, searching for any signs of deception. When he was satisfied, he released his grip and stepped back. "Get out of here," he said, his tone firm. "And don't come back." The man didn't need to be told twice. He took off running, disappearing into the shadows. Ryan waited a few moments before retreating to his car. He had a new lead now, and he wasn't going to waste it. By the time he reached the edge of the woods, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the landscape. Ryan parked his car and grabbed his bag, setting off on foot toward the cabin. The air was cool and still, the only sound the crunch of leaves beneath his boots. As he approached the cabin, Ryan's senses were on high alert. He could see faint lights spilling from the windows and the low hum of a generator somewhere nearby. He moved carefully, staying out of sight as he circled the building, looking for a way in. Inside, he could hear Reaper's voice again, though this time it was calmer, almost casual. Ryan couldn't make out the words, but he didn't need to. He knew this was it, the moment everything had been building toward. Ryan took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest. He wasn't just walking into a confrontation, he was walking into the unknown. And whatever happened next would change everything. Ryan steadied his breathing, keeping low as he moved closer to the cabin. Every instinct told him to proceed carefully, but his mind raced with the possibilities of what he might find inside. From his vantage point, he could make out two voices now, Reaper's and someone else's, rougher and unfamiliar. The second voice carried a sharp edge, and it wasn't long before their conversation grew louder, the tone heated. "You're not listening," the second man barked, his words punctuated by the thud of something heavy hitting a table. "You think this Navy SEAL is your only problem. You've got bigger issues now. Words out, Reaper. People are asking questions." Reaper's voice followed, tight with frustration. "I didn't ask for any of this. You think I don't know what's at stake. That guy's got a target on my back, and now you're telling me there's more." Ryan froze, straining to hear more. The mention of his name, or at least his role, made his stomach tighten. He hadn't anticipated this. If Reaper was already under pressure from someone else, the situation was far more complicated than Ryan had thought. The second man laughed darkly, his voice dropping into a menacing tone. "The old woman wasn't just some random victim. You think you're unlucky. She's connected. Her son's a SEAL, sure, but there's more. You've stepped into a mess you can't clean up on your own. You know who she used to work for." Ryan's heart skipped a beat. His mother. Evelyn had never spoken much about her work before retiring, only ever mentioning bits and pieces about her time in a government office. Could there be something she'd never told him? He felt a sharp pang of unease. Was this why Reaper's crew seemed so panicked? Inside the cabin, Reaper's voice softened, but it was no less tense. "What are you saying?" The second man's response was chillingly deliberate. "I'm saying her name's been flagged before. Old intel. People with long memories. Now there's chatter, people wondering why you'd cross someone like that. And if they dig deeper, they're gonna find your name and mine." Ryan's mind reeled. His mother wasn't just a retired government employee. There was more to her past than she'd let on. It explained her calmness after the incident, her insistence on moving past it without retaliation. She knew something he didn't, something that made this situation far more dangerous than he'd realized. Ryan edged closer to the cabin, his pulse quickening as the conversation inside continued. He couldn't leave now, not when answers were so close. He crouched by a window, carefully peering in. Reaper sat at the table, his face tight with tension. Across from him, the second man loomed, his posture aggressive. The dim light cast sharp shadows across the room, amplifying the tension between them. Reaper slammed his fist on the table, his frustration boiling over. "What do you expect me to do? Disappear? That seal's not going to stop until he gets what he wants, and now you're telling me I've got more people gunning for me." The second man leaned in, his voice dropping low. "You're not getting it. This isn't just about you anymore. If you don't handle this cleanly, they'll come after everyone. Your crew, your hideouts, everything you've built. And if that Navy guy finds out what you've really been up to, you're finished." Ryan felt a surge of anger and confusion. What do they mean by what you've really been up to? This wasn't just about a reckless biker running someone off the road. There was something deeper here, something bigger than he'd anticipated. As the two men argued, Ryan shifted his weight slightly, trying to get a better view of the room. That's when he heard it, a faint snap of a twig behind him. He turned quickly, his hand reaching for his knife. A figure emerged from the shadows, dressed in dark clothing and moving with practiced stealth. Ryan's pulse spiked. Whoever this was, they weren't just a random passerby. They'd been tracking him. The figure stepped closer, and Ryan caught a glimpse of their face, a woman, her expression sharp and focused. She held up a finger to her lips, signaling for silence. Ryan hesitated, his instincts torn between confrontation and caution. "Don't move," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You're in over your head." Ryan narrowed his eyes but stayed still, assessing her. She didn't seem hostile, but her presence raised more questions than answers. "Who are you?" he whispered back, keeping his voice low. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she glanced toward the cabin, her gaze sharp and calculating. "Not here," she said finally. "If you want to survive this, follow me, quietly." Ryan hesitated. He didn't trust her, but he also couldn't ignore the fact that she seemed to know more about the situation than he did. Reluctantly, he nodded and followed her as she moved silently through the trees. When they were far enough from the cabin, she stopped and turned to face him. "Listen carefully," she said, her tone urgent. "You're not just dealing with a biker gang. Reaper's crew is tied to something much bigger. Illegal arms deals, trafficking, things that don't just go away if you take down one man. Your mother's name, it's got history, and if you keep pushing, you're going to pull a lot of dangerous people out of the shadows." Ryan stared at her, his mind racing. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was a web of secrets and threats, and he was caught in the middle of it. "Who are you?" he asked again, his voice firm. She hesitated, her gaze steady. "Someone who used to work with your mother," she said finally. "And someone who knows exactly how far this can go if you're not careful." Ryan's jaw tightened. The stakes had just risen, and the path ahead was more uncertain than ever. But one thing was clear: he couldn't stop now, not when the truth was so close. Ryan stared at the woman, her words echoing in his mind. Someone who worked with his mother. That revelation was almost too much to process, but there wasn't time to dwell on it. He could feel the weight of her warning pressing down on him. This wasn't just about Reaper or even justice for his mom. It was bigger, darker, and more dangerous than he'd imagined. "I don't back down," Ryan said, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "If Reaper's tied to something bigger, I need to know what it is. And if my mom is somehow connected, I deserve to know why." The woman sighed, as if she'd expected this response. "Then you'd better be ready for what comes next. Once you start pulling at these threads, there's no going back. These people don't forgive or forget, and they'll come for you." "I'm not afraid of them," Ryan said firmly. "I faced worse." She studied him for a moment, then nodded. "All right, if you're going to do this, you need to know the truth. Your mom wasn't just a government employee. She worked in counterintelligence. For years, she tracked and dismantled operations like the one Reaper's involved in. When she retired, she disappeared off their radar, until now. That's why she's so calm about all this. She knows how to handle people like him. Ryan felt a surge of pride and disbelief. His mother had always been strong, but he'd never imagined her as someone who took down criminal networks. It made sense now, why she hadn't wanted him to escalate things. She understood the risks better than anyone. "So why didn't she tell me?" Ryan asked, frustration creeping into his voice. "Probably to protect you," the woman replied. "But now it's too late for that. Reaper and his crew stirred up trouble, and they don't even realize how deep they sunk. If you want to stop them, you need to do it fast, and you need to be smart about it. Ryan, you need to come down to Main Street right now," his neighbor, Mr. Jensen, said, his voice strained. "It's your mom." Those words hit him like a freight train. Without asking for details, Ryan grabbed his keys and rushed out the door, his heart pounding in his chest. Every possible scenario ran through his mind. Was she okay? Was it an accident? The few minutes it took to get there felt like hours. When he arrived, Ryan saw the small crowd gathered near the crosswalk. His mom was sitting on the curb, surrounded by concerned faces, but what struck him most was the look in her eyes, calm but distant, as if she was trying to process what had just happened. "Mom." Ryan pushed through the crowd, kneeling beside her. He gently took her hand, scanning her for injuries. "What happened? Are you hurt?" Evelyn's expression softened when she saw him, and for a moment her tough exterior cracked. "Oh, Ryan, I'm fine," she said, though her voice quivered slightly. "Just a little shaken up, that's all." "She's lucky it wasn't worse," Mr. Jensen interjected, his tone heavy with anger. That maniac on the motorcycle barely missed her, didn't even stop to check if she was alive. Ryan's jaw clenched, his gaze shifting to the skid marks on the pavement. The pieces of her groceries were still scattered, a loaf of bread crushed under a passing car. His chest tightened. He had seen a lot in his life, things that most people couldn't even imagine. But seeing his mother like this ignited a fire inside him that was hard to contain. "Did anyone see which way he went?" Ryan asked, his voice calm but laced with an edge. A younger woman in the crowd nodded. "He sped off toward the highway. Black bike, no plates that I could see. The guy was wearing a dark helmet, too. Made it impossible to see his face." Ryan's mind started working immediately, piecing together the details. He wasn't just angry, he was focused, his training kicking in without a second thought. This wasn't just about finding the biker, it was about ensuring no one else got hurt. The ambulance arrived shortly after, and the paramedics insisted on checking Evelyn out, despite her protests. "It's just a scratch," she kept saying, but Ryan knew better. He stayed by her side, reassuring her with quiet words while keeping an ear out for any more details from the witnesses. As they loaded her into the ambulance, Ryan turned to Mr. Jensen. "Can you grab her things and bring them to the house? I'm going to follow the ambulance and make sure she's okay." Mr. Jensen nodded. "Of course, don't worry about a thing." At the hospital, the doctors confirmed that Evelyn had no major injuries, just some bruising and a sprained wrist. Ryan felt a wave of relief, but couldn't shake the anger simmering beneath the surface. Evelyn, sensing his unease, placed a hand on his arm. "Ryan, don't do anything foolish," she said softly. "Let the police handle this." He gave her a small smile, but his silence spoke volumes. He wasn't planning on sitting this one out. After ensuring his mom was settled back at home and had everything she needed, Ryan went to his car and drove back to the scene of the incident. The street was quiet now, the crowd long gone, but Ryan wasn't looking for witnesses anymore. He was looking for clues. Walking along the crosswalk, he studied the skid marks more closely. The biker had been going too fast, that much was clear. He followed the faint trail of rubber and noticed a small piece of torn fabric caught on the edge of a nearby bush. Picking it up, he examined it closely. It was black, likely from the biker's jacket or gear. It wasn't much, but it was something. As Ryan stood there, the faint hum of a motorcycle in the distance caught his attention. He turned sharply, his eyes scanning the horizon, but the sound faded as quickly as it had come. It was a reminder that the man he was looking for could be anywhere, and that this wasn't going to be easy. Back at the house, Ryan pulled out his laptop and started researching. He wasn't just relying on luck, he was methodical. He looked up local motorcycle groups, events, and forums. A biker that Ruthless wasn't just a loner, he was likely part of a scene. The hours ticked by as Ryan pieced together a mental map of possible leads. He wasn't sure what he'd find, but one thing was certain: he wouldn't stop until he had answers. And as the night deepened, so did his resolve. The biker might have thought he could disappear into the night, but Ryan knew better. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The following morning, Ryan woke early, his mind still racing with the details of the previous day. His mother had insisted she was fine, and though she smiled as she sipped her tea at the kitchen table, Ryan could see the way she winced every time she moved her wrist. She didn't complain, she never did, but that only made his determination grow stronger. Ryan nodded, his resolve hardening. Then let's finish this. Together, they made their way back to the cabin, moving silently through the trees. Ryan felt a renewed sense of purpose, his training kicking into overdrive. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about protecting his mom and ensuring that Reaper and his associates couldn't hurt anyone else. When they reached the cabin, the voices inside had quieted. Ryan motioned for the woman to stay back while he approached the door. He could feel a tension building with every step, his senses hyper-focused. He pushed the door open quietly, stepping into the dimly lit room. Reaper and the second man were still there, but something had changed. Reaper looked cornered, his face pale and his body tense. The second man had a gun resting on the table, his hand hovering near it. "You don't need to do this," Reaper was saying, his voice laced with desperation. "We can work something out." "Too late for that," the other man replied coldly. "You've been sloppy, and now we're all exposed. This ends here." Ryan stepped forward, his presence commanding. "Put the gun down," he said, his voice sharp and unwavering. Both men turned to look at him, their expressions a mix of shock and anger. "You," Reaper spat. "You just can't let this go, can you?" Ryan ignored him, his focus on the second man. "Whatever Reaper did, you don't need to clean it up this way. You pull that trigger, and you're just as exposed as he is." The man hesitated, his hand twitching near the gun. Ryan could see the conflict in his eyes. He wanted to end this, but he wasn't ready to face the consequences. "Walk away," Ryan said firmly. "Take your people and leave. Let the law deal with Reaper." For a moment, it seemed like the man might listen. But then, with a growl of frustration, he grabbed the gun and aimed it at Reaper. Ryan moved instantly, closing the distance and knocking the gun from the man's hand before he could fire. The weapon clattered to the floor, and a struggle erupted. Ryan's training took over, his movements precise and efficient. Within seconds, he had the man pinned. Reaper tried to make a run for it, but the woman appeared in the doorway, blocking his path. She held a small weapon of her own, her stance steady. "Not so fast," she said, her voice calm. Ryan secured the second man, tying his hands with a zip tie from his bag. Then he turned to Reaper, his expression cold. "It's over," he said. Reaper sneered, but there was fear in his eyes. "You think this ends with me," he said. "You don't know what you've just started." Ryan didn't respond. He didn't need to. When the authorities arrived, Ryan and the woman gave their statements, careful to stick to the facts. Reaper and his associate were taken into custody, and the operation they'd been running was exposed. It would take time to dismantle it fully, but the first steps had been taken. As Ryan watched the cars drive away, his mom's words from days ago echoed in his mind. She'd been right to warn him, but he didn't regret his actions. He'd done what needed to be done, and he protected the people he cared about. The woman turned to him, her expression unreadable. "You've made enemies tonight," she said, "but you've also made a difference. Don't forget that." Ryan nodded. "I won't." One evening, as Ryan and Evelyn sat in the backyard, A gentle breeze rustling the trees, she reached over and placed a hand on his. "I never wanted this life for you," she said softly, "but I'm proud of the man you've become. Your father would be too." Ryan looked at her, the weight of her words settling over him. He had spent so much time trying to protect her, only to realize she had been doing the same for him all along. "I'm proud of you too," he said, his voice thick with emotion. For the first time in years, they allowed themselves to simply be, mother and son, connected by more than just blood. They were a team, shaped by the trials they had faced and the choices they had made. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Ryan felt a sense of closure. The fight was over, but the lessons it had taught him would stay with him forever. He had learned the value of resilience, the power of standing up for others, and the importance of facing the truth, no matter how difficult it might be. Evelyn leaned back in her chair, a small smile playing on her lips. "You know," she said, her tone light, "I think I might take up gardening. Something quiet, for a change." Ryan chuckled, the sound breaking the tension that had lingered for so long. "Gardening, huh? I'll believe it when I see it." She laughed softly, and for the first time in what felt like forever, the air around them was filled with peace. The past might have been complicated and the future uncertain, but in that moment everything felt exactly as it should. Ryan and Evelyn sat together as the stars began to appear, their bonds stronger than ever and their hearts lighter for having faced the storm and come out on the other side.